This video is sponsored by Wing Technology, your ultimate flight sim hardware solution.
Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing very well. Today is going to be what I hope is a really cool interview. Please say hello, Mark.
Good afternoon all.
Let's just run through your synopsis so we see who we're dealing with here first. Aircraft propulsion engineer and Formula One IT specialist. Now here's the thing, you're mixing my two favourite things in the world. A, combat aircraft. B, Formula One and or just anything that burns petrol and goes fast. I get the feeling we're going to segue off the track lots of times here, but that's cool. So I've been really looking forward to this.
So. Yeah.
I'm going to go through the history. 1979 to 1996. Royal Air Force, aircraft engineer, propulsion, working on Tornado, Hawk, Sea King, Wessex, that's Chopper, isn't it?
Yep.
Buccaneer, and Hunter. March 1996 to 1999. Number 4 School of Technical Training, RAF, St Athan, Technical Officer IT for the Ministry of Defence at RAF St Athan. 2002 to 2015. Williams Formula One IT specialist travelling with the race team. Now, some guys might not understand what that means, so let me just quickly check. So, Formula One, just in case you don't know, because everyone all over the world listens, obviously it's the biggest, the top racing there is in the world, basically, motor car racing. And you have several teams, you have about 10 to 12 teams, and those teams travel every couple of weeks to a new country and do a race, and a large part of that team will travel with them, and Mark was travelling with them as an IT specialist, and needless to say we're going to hear lots of stories about how technical these cars are and all the systems behind it and stuff like that, and very excited about that, so that should be good. Currently iTech Xerox as senior engineer, major project. My first flight sim was on the Amiga F-18 Interceptor by Bob Dinnerman, 1991. So I was 11 years old. Okay, I don't remember it, but that is about the time I was just getting into my first computers, so I should be able to remember it, I suppose. I had every flight sim there was on the Amiga. What happened to Amiga when they bought out or something? Because they were kicking PC's ass.
I think basically when PCs got really popular, when PC World started chucking them out for pennies or relative pennies, they just dwindled away. I mean, you're right, it did have a massive following, and it was the computer to have for gaming and simming, alongside the Atari. Yeah, so it just sort of dwindled away, didn't it?
Was Amiga something separate to Bill Gates, or was it his umbrella?
Well, it was by Commodore.
Right.
So I don't think it came under Bill Gates.
No, very interesting. Okay, bought a PC in 1993 and gradually migrated over to that for simming. Yeah, Microsoft Flight Simulator 1. Do you remember that?
Indeed.
It's ingrained in my memory. I know it always seems a lot better than it actually is, but it's ingrained in my memory. Was writing flight sim reviews for an online mag called Game Over in the mid-90s. Used to get loads of pre-release sims. Falcon 4 was one I recalled with great excitement. I had to write 2,500 words on each sim. I think that one got 5k plus. Recently got back into DCS as the new Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 let me down. I'm sure we're going to talk about that because that sounds exciting. Firstly, a couple of pictures. So we're going to have yourself next to a buck. So how old are you in that picture next to the buck?
Well, I would have been 21 in front of the buck. 21. That was actually taken in Bergstrom, Texas, as we were staging our way over to Red Flag. So we went in 2 Hercules, flied 2 different sets of aircraft over, stopping along the way to do refuels and overnight stops until we got to Nellis. The other picture with me in the camo is when I was at St Athan. That would have been early 90s, 93. There's me working on the car at a PR event. I didn't used to work on the car as a matter of course, but when they were short of people and events like that, just doing PR stuff, they used to let me get my hands on the real item.
You look like you know what you're doing as well, so that helps, rather than some fresh-faced 16-year-old kid.
I still had to be told exactly what to do. It's just something as simple as taking the tyre blanket off is fraught with danger. Like there's cords that hang off that tie it together, and you can get them caught up in the transmission, the drive axles, and it's just like there's so many things you've got to check. Just a simple thing like that.
Absolutely.
And so you don't want to embarrass yourself, so you
No.
pay adherence to the guidance. That other picture is me at, I think, the first Texas Grand Prix. I was checking the cameras on the pit boom. That's when the FIA said we had to start recording all our pit stops.
Right.
So if there's an incident, we give them the footage.
What year would that have been roughly?
Oh God, when was the first Indy? Well, not Indy. Austin. That's at Austin.
I actually remember it. I remember it, but I couldn't tell you what year it was, so I wouldn't have a clue. But okay, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so as I'm sure you're aware, at this point, rather than me asking you silly questions, I pass it over to the valued viewers. They ask you whatever question they want. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes just downright ugly. But we'll see how it goes. Anything before we kick off?
I would just like to say I've read through the questions.
Cool.
And I'd like to thank the valued viewers for their breadth and depth of questions. They're fantastic. So we'll see how we go.
Wicked. Very good. Okay, question 1. What aspects of working in the military, in terms of getting things done, would you want to bring to, I'm just going to stretch this out, the civilian world, and vice versa? What aspect of the civilian world are missing in the military?
First thing you've got to realise is the two worlds are poles apart, completely different. And because you have such massive discipline in the military, which is pretty ingrained into everybody from day one of training, it's very difficult to compare the two. However, I would say maybe the civvy world needs a bit less clock watching. However, I think nowadays with the pandemic, people are quite keen to keep their jobs, and losing your job is a bit more important. So maybe people will be a bit more switched on in the civvy world when it comes to not chatting back to your manager so much. The RAF, or the military itself, has so much to offer. You're more or less sort of in a cotton-wooled environment. When you're on the base, I mean, you've got everything you need. You don't really need to go off the base at all. You've got shopping facilities, sport, absolutely everything. And yeah, you're cocooned in your own environment, and you'd only really leave the base to go and enjoy a restaurant or a beer or two somewhere, do a bit of supermarket shopping. It's just because they're so different. The two environments are just so different. And you see this when people leave the military and come back into civvy life. They tend to struggle quite a lot. Some people do, especially if they've relied on the military all their working life.
Because of the lack of structure, presumably.
Probably, yeah. And the lack of procedure and discipline and everything that comes hand in hand with the military life. It just doesn't compare to Civvy Street.
Okay, very good. Something a bit different. How did you get into Formula One?
Interesting. When I was an engineer in the RAF, I'd applied to various Formula One teams to see if I could get in as a mechanic on my aircraft engineering virtues. And I just got no from all of them for a long time. And when I transformed over to an IT person, when I left the RAF, and I was working for the MOD, I ended up working in a company alongside a girl whose husband worked for Jaguar Formula One team.
Wow.
And he said to her, tell Mark that Williams are looking for a test team person, IT specialist. So I thought, well, we could try another angle. So I applied, got shortlisted, got the job. And that's when I started working at Williams on 2nd of Jan 2002. And it's really weird. I was told to turn up at the factory at 0700 hours, get on the bus and go to Spain. I'd fly to Spain, and that was it. I was really in at the deep end. I had one guy with me who'd done it before, and that was it. Off I went testing for the start of the 2002 winter testing season. And yeah, very steep learning curve. So that is how I got in. Not the route I'd initially planned, though. I really wanted to be working on the cars, but I was quite happy with the IT side.
Why didn't they? Any idea why they weren't interested in an RAF engineer from the mechanical side? Because that would have seemed ideal to me. Someone who's been brought up in discipline and doing things the right way and stuff like that. Maybe they needed something else.
Yeah, when I joined Williams, there was two guys there that I actually knew from the Air Force who were
how about that?
Airframe technicians. And I never knew they were there. I just met them as I was there on the shop floor.
Mm-hmm.
So they do employ a lot of ex-RAF engineers or military engineers. But I was just unlucky. Obviously, my CV wasn't good enough.
Yeah, and wrong place, wrong time. And
yeah,
a lot of things like this I've found, not personally, but I've heard of. I know two other guys that worked for McLaren. And a lot of it is not necessarily like being the right person, but knowing the right person.
Absolutely.
But your story, if you hadn't known that guy for the Jaguar team, you wouldn't have got that heads up, and there was no way you would have seen that advertised. So you've got to know the right person to get the right lead, to get in the right place, or maybe get a thumbs up from someone else. So isn't that funny how that works?
That's right. It really was. It's just networking, and it really is. You've hit the nail on the head. It's who you know. And just a bit of luck and being in the right time and right place.
Right, okay. And the reverse question, go back a few decades, I suppose. What got you into aviation in the first place?
When I used to live in Wales, far west Wales, in my teens. And I worked on a farm. And when I was out on the fields helping them, the jets from Broady, the Hawks and Hunters, used to come over 100, 200 feet during their training sorties. And I thought it was bloody impressive. And I wanted to know more about it. So I got some books and I started reading, identified the aircraft, found out where they came from, what they were doing. And it was also, because it is low flying area number 7, we had American aircraft come around as well. A-10s, F-111s, a few Vulcans now and again. Yeah, it's an area of high intensity, low flying. We even had a F-111 crash up the road from us one year.
Amazing.
And yeah, so I just thought, I want to work on them, because I was learning a lot of mechanics working on the farm, working on the tractors and the balers and what have you. And it wasn't so much the animals that interested me, it's the mechanical side of it, driving tractors, fixing them, which is great when you're sort of 13, 14, 15. And when it came to school recruitment time, when you go and talk to a load of recruiters in the school hall, there was a RAF guy there, and I went and said, I want to be an aircraft mechanic or technician. And he sorted out the aptitude test for me. And off I went. The rest was history. I ended up joining November 1978, going to Swinderby for basic training, and then onward to Halton for the flight line mechanic training. So that's how that happened.
It's funny, we must have had nearly 50 interviews now. I asked the same question to everyone. It's always the same. Either their parents were in aviation, or just like you and me, you were lucky enough to live in a place where these things just bombarded you every day, and if you've got a certain type of brain, then your future's set one way or another. You can't unlearn it. It worries me ever so slightly in the future that the chance to be bombarded by aeroplanes like that is less and less, with less and less aeroplanes about and so on, having them more tightly regulated and so on. I wonder things about how are the next generation going to be so inspired. Then again, we have such good virtual simulators and stuff now. I guess we didn't have any of that, did we? So I guess that's where it's going now.
I definitely understand where you're coming from, but I mean, now we've got simulators like DCS, that are so realistic, and they might get it into their mind, I'd like to go and do this for real,
Right.
and they're probably halfway there, having learnt all the systems on DCS.
Yeah. You can get a lot of mindset as well. If you join a big clan in DTS, a proper one that's doing proper missions, you can actually get a really, really good mindset in terms of the discipline, in terms of working with others, in terms of all the things that are going to be important. No, you'll have to, yes, I mean, you won't be able to bring that training directly over. You'll have to retrain when you enter your Air Force, but it's going to give you a good mindset and some basic skills.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the things that you're doing on the Grim Reapers, like the time over target, strict time
Right.
over target missions, that will instill in budding aviators the need for good airmanship, planning, procedures, and all that horrible stuff that comes outside of actually flying the aircraft.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely good exposure.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Next, now I've already had a RAF Tornado Sooty and RAF Tornado and Hawk Sooty on, and so it'll be interesting to see how your answers vary to his. But in your opinion, what was the Tornado in terms of your propulsion side like to work on?
So I need to clarify that when I was working on Tornado and Hawk, it was on the engines when they were at St. Athan in the
Right.
overhaul facility. I wasn't actually on the squadron. I was on the overhaul side of it. And
That's even more interesting for me. Get the
yeah,
nuts and bolts.
because they're modular engines, they would come in and they would be stripped down in modular form first. All the ancillaries on the outside taken off and sent for servicing, and then it's basically a case of strip, inspect, or clean, inspect, repair as necessary. And it's once you worked on a modular engine, moving on to another one isn't much different other than size, maybe a bit of technology changing. And what was also useful at St. Athan, we had our own Rolls-Royce representatives from an engineering perspective. So you always had Rolls-Royce on hand to give any advice. It does become a bit of a factory sort of environment, because once you've stripped your first few engines and rebuilt them, it's a case of just running the treadmill, I'm afraid.
Right, yeah.
However, there is still satisfaction from an engineering point of view to be had if you're that way inclined, doing a full strip and clean and inspect and rebuild. Sadly, we didn't have an engine test facility at St. Athan for testing the engines in a proper test house. They tended to get reinstalled into the airframe and then run out on the other side of the airfield. However, when I was in the Gnome engine bay for the Wessex, we did have a test house, and that was probably the most enjoyable experience I had servicing engines, because as a team, I was the corporal with two mechanics, and you would get the engine in, put it on an upright stand, strip it all the way down, clean as you go, inspecting everything, replace as necessary, build it all back up, and then you go and put it on the test bed and spend a day testing it, adhering to all the procedures, take down all the readings, and then you pack it up ready for issue to an airframe.
Roger.
And so I've kind of strayed off a bit there, but so with regard to the Tornado and the Hawk, I just saw them as modular units, and I was in a repair coordination duty, whereas I had to inspect repaired items and reissue them for fitment to engines. Once again, that can become a bit boring, really, because you never really end up turning and burning anything. It is just an engineering rebuild exercise. So that partially answers your question.
Yeah, there's only one thing I didn't quite get. You talk about, for instance, the 199 from the Tornado being a modular engine. What does that actually mean? It being a modular engine as opposed to, and what's not a modular engine?
So I guess all engines are in their own sense. However, you would have a set module for the compressor section. The compressor would be split away from the combustion chamber, and that would be dealt with as a single entity. The casings, obviously, you've got the rotating assembly, which is all one because it's connected to the turbine. So that the rotating assembly is another component. However, the modules, yeah, it's basically dividing the engine up into its component areas: compressor, combustion section, turbine, exhaust unit. That kind of that's what it means.
Modular. And what would be and how would we now look at a non-modular engine? Is it? I'm just trying to think what it would
probably
be like.
if you looked at an Avon that's in a Hunter,
Yeah.
that's not really modular, although it does have those specific areas which every turbojet would have.
Yeah.
It tends to have bits of the system dotted all over the engine.
Yeah.
So it's not really, you can't just pull it apart. You can't undo all the nuts on the flange and separate it. Everything has to come off before you start getting to the core.
I'm looking at an Avon now, and you can't just kind of slice the front off, if you know what I mean. Like you can.
That's right.
Right, I get it. And that's design, and it's like that because it makes maintenance easier, presumably.
Indeed, yeah.
Right, okay, makes sense. Right, very good. Let's push on. Which propulsion system, we've answered number 5, which propulsion system did you find most challenging to work on, and which did you enjoy the most? You were talking about chopper engines there, but anything you wanted to add to that?
I've answered it already, really. It would be the Gnome engine that I used to work on. For the reasons that I stated, there was a lot of satisfaction to be had staying on one engine itself for like a month, doing all that work, and at the end of it, you can see the fruition of your hard work. I've answered it already, really.
Yep. No, very good. Okay, was it a big challenge to maintain older types in service as the airframes were stressed and towards the end of their service lives in some cases? So, I mean, you were propulsion based, but how does that relate to you?
Well, when the Buccaneers had their wing spar problem back after the red flag crash in, oh crikey, was it 1980? We lost the jet out on red flag, and the subsequent investigation revealed serious fatigue cracks in the wing spars. So we had to get the jets back. We flew them all back under very light G restrictions. And when they got back to the hangars in the UK, we had to drill holes into the spars and inspect the cracking areas. Some of them got written off, and some of them needed repair, big BAE repair specs applied to them. So that was due to some of them being ex-Navy airframes and the subsequent deck landings after so many traps. The wear and tear, the G loadings on the wing roots had just created these fatigue cracks. Hence, the Buccaneer got stamped with a G limitation. Can't remember exactly what it was. I think each airframe had a different one, but it certainly couldn't pull as much G as it used to be famous for. So that was quite sad. But the Buccaneer still ended up doing, 31 years of service.
Yeah, right.
Even with that fatigue problem.
This is new to me. I wasn't aware of this. Were these spars, were they steel or alloy, or aluminium or alloy?
I think they're alloy. They were machined out of a solid billet of aluminium alloy. I'd have to Google it. Damn, I can't remember what material it was. But it was like a spectacle. If you can imagine, there was a hole in the middle, and then it would extend out, and there'd be two holes for the engines. It was almost like looking at a pair of spectacles. And it was the first time that they've been manufactured in this way, and they did it out of a solid billet of metal to try and maintain integrity and strength. And obviously that was there, but it was just the punishment they got in the Navy was just too much. And these cracks were not identifiable by just looking with the human eye. You had to do some X-raying and ultrasonic tests before you could find the cracks.
So I thought we were going to go off on a tangent, and we are by the looks of it. So was this first picked up in the red flag incident then, or was this known about before?
No, it wasn't known about before. It was basically the investigation they did, where it's probably the AAIB, the Air Investigation Bureau. They would have just taken it apart with a fine-tooth comb, I guess, and they found that was the cause. The wing spar cracked and the wing came off, basically. They did suspect the hinge pins, downlock pins that lock the wings down, and we checked all them, and most of them were okay. They were known to have cracks now and again, but I don't think they failed before. But it was the wing spar that caused the red flag incident.
Because I mean, this isn't the first time a 50s designed aircraft has had, and I think this was 50s designed. You remember the Valiant that had maybe not identical, but similar problems. I wonder if there was a problem in the RAF at the time, or the manufacturing engineering firms at the time, that just because the idea of designing a plane is you design it in a way where you use the alloys that has tested that you know exactly how many carrier traps, you know exactly how many 9G turns it can do before it's going to crack. And the Valiant and this appear to have been calculated erroneously, used the wrong alloy or whatever.
I guess you could say that. I mean, obviously they would have done testing on the prototype airframes. Maybe if they'd have tested them for long enough, they would have found out the problem. But maybe time just wasn't available, or it just wasn't cost effective enough to test the airframe for so many hundreds or thousands of simulated traps.
Makes you wonder if I suspect that metallurgy, if that's the right word, and modelling now is such that you can just take an alloy number, put it through a computer, and it's going to say, "Bing, this is what it can take at this this grade of quality." Back then, I guess it just wasn't there, was it?
There's the fantastic design processes now that can you can spot stress raises on a computer when you're modelling the design, and it'll show you where all the stress points are and where you need to maybe put an extra radius in or what have you. I guess if you were to redesign those spectacle frames on the Buccaneer, it would come up and say, no, you need a bit more metal here, or make this radius bigger.
Yeah, that's interesting. Really, really interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how far things have come in terms of modelling. You go all the way back to the Comet square windows, circular windows. It's like I didn't even know that, and now you can get a complex 3D shape that's going to be at 800 degrees Celsius and have this much vibration, and you can predict it. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, imagine if you said that to a Joe. An aircraft Joe blogs nowadays. Oh, we're going to put square windows in there. I don't think so, chap.
Right.
But now we know.
Wouldn't even put it on your car. Yeah. No. Very good. Okay. Very good. That's a good story. What was the first propulsion system you worked on? I guess in terms of aviation.
Well, in training, it was the Hunter Avon and the Viper in the Jet Provost. But then my first posting was Buccaneers at Honington on 237 OCU. So that was introduction to the Spey, the mighty Spey, which indeed was in the Phantom also. Big engine, lots of power.
Yep.
Nice bit of kit, really was, Rolls-Royce. And then I was also working on the Hunters alongside the Buccaneers, because we had some Hunters on 237 that had Buccaneer instruments. So we used those for training aircrew before they actually went and flew a Buccaneer. So the Hunter's got an Avon, and all the twin-seat Avons have cartridge start. They have a breech at the front of the engine that accepts 3 big brass cartridges. They're about, I don't know, almost a foot long, about 3.5 inches in diameter, full of cordite. And they go into a cap that you have to get in front of the engine in a hatch and reach up. You can't see it. You have to do it all by hand. You reach up and you find the hole and slot the cartridge in and tighten it up. It's on a ratchet mechanism, so it can't come off. And you had to do all 3 of these. And the funny thing is, the area where you have to reach up is the fuel vent for the Hunter when it's being refueled.
Cool.
So if it's being refueled and someone overfills it, you get covered in fuel, which you have to watch out for. But that was interesting. Sometimes you couldn't get the cartridges out when the aircraft lands again.
Why not?
The one that's fired, because they get so hot and sooty. If someone's done it up too tight, it's really difficult to get out. We had special spanners manufactured because you can't get a proper leverage on the damn thing. So you'd be up there with this special spanner. You can't see it because it's so high up, and you need really, really long arms. And it was right performance.
Roger. I'm literally searching on my YouTube site at the moment. I remember taking a picture. You know, the Canberra had cartridge start, didn't it? I'm just trying to find it.
Yeah. I think the Canberra just took 1 cartridge, and the Hunter took 3. I believe they were the same cartridges. I didn't work on the Canberra, but I'm familiar that it did have a cartridge start mechanism. And yeah, they used to go off with a hell of a bang.
How do you spell Canberra? I thought it was Camberra. It's not coming up, which is really annoying.
I thought it was that.
I'll find it now.
And in fact, when the Buccaneer wing spar problem happened and the Bucks were grounded, we were given some extra Hunters out of storage at Kemble. There was a load of old F6s that had been retired from 4FTS, and the single-seat Hunters are half-pin start. So they don't start the cartridge, they start with this liquid fuel called avpin, which is a monofuel. It makes its own oxygen. It's horrible stuff, hideous.
Never heard of it.
And if it catches on fire, you can't really put it out.
Because exactly that reason, you can't starve it of oxygen, right?
That's right. It creates its own oxygen. So it was hideous stuff.
I'm going to show this Canberra start just to the valued viewers.
Yep.
So that's fired through. Is it like gunpowder? I've always imagined
full of cordite. Yeah.
Cordite, right? Wow.
That's what you get in ammunition shells.
Did you ever? I'm not sure where you're based. Did you ever go to Bruntingthorpe?
I haven't made it there. I'm in touch with the guys.
Yeah.
And now they've moved to Kemble. Yeah, I know a few of them by email.
Shame, it was really amazing. So gutted I've lost that. But anyway, yeah, that was great. I mean, it's literally just a bomb, inside the engine, and just
it is. It's
so
like
loud.
Blooming explosion. And if you've got your back to the aircraft when it goes off and you're looking at your aircraft that's not started yet, it really makes you jump because it's just so instantaneous. There's an electrical charge that's sent to it. It's not a percussion cap, it's electrical detonation, and it's just instantaneous.
It's a good idea, isn't it? It's literally bung a couple of cartridges in, boom, you're started immediately, and yeah.
Well, it's really good if the aircraft lands away for an emergency and wants to get back up on its own again. Doesn't need any help from ground staff or anything. You can just use, if it's only used 1 cartridge on the initial start when it took off from its main base, it's still got 2 cartridges left. This is on the T7 Hunter. Yep. So yeah, it's very useful. You've got 2 more shots of self-sustaining starts.
Very good. Okay. Next, was there enough? So back in the 80s, I guess, was there enough equipment to allow you to do your job well in the early days of your military career?
Yes. Yeah. Always well supplied. No, I can't ever remember, especially on the flight line work, being short of anything. Maybe on detachment when you go. I mean, we used to go to Deci Mimanu in Sardinia for bombing practice, or up to Lossiemouth. Sometimes you might run out of spares, but you take a load of spares with you, but you can't plan for everything. And if you did run out of something, you could always phone back and get someone to jump in one of the hunters and carry it in the passenger seat.
That's quite cool.
So no, I think the answer to that is didn't run out of any supplies,
Roger.
and there was enough equipment.
Okay, the next one. What will you remember about the Sea King? Looks like such a beast to me. I remember seeing them in the 90s Mildenhall air shows. I think they had a display there. But otherwise, I've never really seen much of them. They look awesome.
I remember it as like the biggest helicopter around at the time.
Yep.
Once again, I didn't work on them on the flight line. It was engine bay only, sadly. But I think the size of the rotor and just the size of the airframe was what stood out for me. Just a huge, until the CH-53
right
appeared from the Americans, and that was like a behemoth. But no, I would say just basically the size of it and the size of the rotor. And it just seemed like a far more serious piece of equipment compared to the Wessex and the Whirlwind.
It stirs up a really old memory that I haven't thought of it maybe in 20 years. When I was probably just hitting double digits, so 11, so like that. Myself, my cousin, my younger brother were taken by our mother to somewhere on the south coast, Bath, somewhere like a little coastal town. And I remember we were out at sea. This is again back in the glory days of the late 80s, early 90s, where England was just peppered in Cold War everything, and you couldn't go. You just took it for granted at the time, especially where I lived. Everywhere you turned was an A10 or something. Anyway, we were out in this dinghy boat, just messing around on the waves, and all of a sudden, these helicopters came in and did an air show. Again, this is before super high regulations, so they weren't that far away from us, a couple 100 feet away from us, and did this awesome air show. And we had no idea this was happening. We were just there by fluke in this town on this beach at the right time, and we must have had 10 choppers came in over the course of half an hour and did this amazing air show. And it was like, what are the chances of that? Things were a bit different back then, and again, one of those things that just really implanted that thing. Big, loud machines are good.
Yeah. In a similar vein, when I was living in Wales, they used to train the forward air controllers. They used to fly around in gazelles and go and land in a field and find a target and then radio to the hunters or hawks what they're supposed to be attacking. And yeah, quite often they'd come and land in the fields near us, and they'd jump out, and the helicopter would take off again and put its spotlight on and point in the direction that the aircraft were going to be coming from, so that they could ID approximate area, and they'd see the light on the helicopter, and then that'd be their like an IP or an action point for them. And that's a similar thing. Very inspiring.
It really is. And I've just only just found out that we had gazelles in the Falklands War.
Good Lord.
Yeah, we've just started looking into it. We're going to do a Falklands campaign, and it means learning about the Falklands, obviously. And I didn't realise we had we lost a load to, I think it was ground fire. We lost a load, but they were there doing, kind of the advanced recce work there. And I was like, I had no idea that any of this happened. So
I didn't know that, and to sidestep a bit, I didn't get involved in the Falklands because at the time I was in Laarbruch in Germany doing basically Cold War support, working on the nuke standby. So I didn't get on the roster for Falklands at all. And I suppose luckily I missed out on all of it. But it was really weird to see all that going on. And then there we were sat in our concrete bunkers in Germany waiting for the big one to go off.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to researching about that. There's so much stuff, and it's not. There's not that much on it. But people have written books, and it's great. But there's very little in terms of video on it. I found people haven't really done it justice. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. But anyway, we should push on. Right, was going from turbojet to turbofan engines a big step forward, and were the later ones easier to maintain and reliable? What turbo? Oh, okay. The RB199 is a turbofan, is it? It must be.
I wonder if he means going to turboprop, because I worked on the HF748 Andover, which was turboprop. So,
right. Well, that is very different then, isn't it?
So that was really different because, in case the viewers don't know, a turbojet is basically compresses the air, burns fuel in it, creates a lot of high pressure and heat, and chucks it out the back as fast as it can, creating the thrust. Whereas in a helicopter engine, that has turned into shaft horsepower. They want all the power from that stream going into a turbine, thus turning the gearbox that turns the rotor. And then on a turboprop, you've got a shaft connected to the propeller that goes all the way through the engine to a free turbine at the back, which then picks up all that energy coming out of the combustion chamber and turns the propeller. So yeah, there's three very different classes of engine there in the way they deliver their power to propel the aircraft. And yeah, there is a big difference. Before you work on any aircraft or engine system, you're always trained to quite a high degree, especially in the RAF. A lot of my courses were done at Rolls-Royce in Derby and Leavesden, and you end up with a certificate from Rolls-Royce saying that you can work on the aircraft. And sometimes you end up doing 2 or 3 courses for different aspects. And I even went to Doughty Rotal in Cheltenham and did a course on the propeller on the Andover, because it's such a complex system. I never realised propellers were so complex. And that was really interesting. That was a very interesting part of my career. I think it was the biggest propeller we had in the RAF, even bigger than the Hercules prop. It was absolutely huge. And they used Dart turboprop engines. So, yeah. I kind of lost track of the question there, sorry. Does that answer it?
Yeah, we're just looking at the differences between them. But okay, moving from that on to virtual. How did you manage to discover DCS? Are you a Flan fan, and do you fly yourself in DCS?
Yes, I do. And as you mentioned already, I used to review flight sims way back when I first got my PC. And in fact, I was rummaging through my boxes in the workshop here the other day, and I found my lock-on disc and Flaming Clear IL2, the original IL2.
How about that?
So yeah, I used to get my hands on the flight sims early to do reviews, and as you mentioned, Falcon 4 was like one that was so eagerly anticipated, expected. It came with a lovely thick manual that you spend nights and nights reading. It was a awesome simulator, and that's pretty much how I got into it. And yeah, you mentioned the F-18 on the Amiga, and that I guess that sowed the seeds. And as soon as the PCs started to become available, I just wanted something with a really good joystick, good graphics. But we all had to wait for that. And as Flight Sim from Microsoft developed, there were a few really good combat sims, but then again, they tended to be games rather than simulations.
Sure.
And then if you wanted a simulation, you ended up on the Microsoft version. So the two never really met until DCS came around, I guess, or Lock On. So that's recently, last year I bought the new Microsoft FS 2020, and I think I played it for a few weeks, and then a patch wrecked it, and now I can't reinstall it. And that's when I threw my teddies out and I said I'm going to go back to DCS, because I've always played DCS, but never really had the time to focus on one specialized airframe. So that's why I decided to jump on with you guys and start learning some airframes properly. And yeah, it's really good. I haven't even thought about going back to the Microsoft version now. I'm just going to stick with DCS. It's just so realistic, and especially with when you introduce comms like SRS and some of the planners you've got, and just watching your mission videos show what it offers. It's an amazing piece of software, and how it's evolved since its early days is really amazing.
To be honest, it's changed. I mean, when something just changes bit by bit by bit, you don't really notice. So I haven't really noticed. But if I go back and watch an old 5-year-old Grim Reapers video, everything is different. It's so funny how that happens. I mean, straight on to the next question. What about Microsoft 2020? What were the reasons to drive you away? Was it below what you expected?
It was, eye candy wise, it was nice, but it did feel really gamey. I mean, I was a big fan of FSX, which obviously had a long lifetime, was poorly supported, but the enthusiast community kept it going, and I had all the UK scenery for it, and you could do some really good low-level military flying in it. I had Buccaneer and Hunter mods for it, obviously, and you could fly around the Mac loop up at Valley. Great fun, but I had high hopes for 2020, but it just didn't really press the buttons. And when I had the patch problem, couldn't reinstall it. No, I've given up on it now.
Roger. I'm going to give it a go. I did. Someone kindly bought it for me, and I did install it, but it simply didn't run on my PC. I was very upset by that. How a modern good game sim, the software just didn't run on my PC. I was like, that's stupid. Anyway, so I'm going to try it. I've got a supercomputer now, so I'm going to try it on this, and hopefully it will actually work. Fingers crossed. See how it goes. But for me, I've no real interest in kind of civilian type flying anyway. It's just not in a simulator anyway. I want to have something with at least 90,000 horsepower. Otherwise, I'm just not quite happy. And several ways of killing you, not just crashing. So.
Indeed, that's it. In the Microsoft offering, you can't drop any bombs.
No, and the other thing is, I immediately did my cap thing. I got in a 747, tried to crash it, and it wouldn't blow up. And I was like, okay, that's turned me off already. But I'm going to try it anyway because I've things that I should do, and that is one of them I should do. So I will give it a fair test. Okay, fair enough. Was switching? We've talked about this one, but I'll ask the question: was switching from military to civilian career? I'm going to try that again. Was switching from military career to a civilian one and going from a race team to a race team difficult transition to you? Sorry about that.
Good question. It wasn't really a massive upheaval because the environments are quite similar. Even though that contradicts what I was saying about military and civilian, the way the two teams operate, you've got the banter, camaraderie, discipline in Formula One, which you need, procedures, and it is very, very similar. On an F1 team, you really are part of the team, and you feel it, and you operate using very similar practices. As you know, maybe the viewers don't, but a lot of the engineering on F1 cars comes from the aviation world, and vice versa. From aviation, it comes over to Formula One. There's kind of a definite crossover in technologies, and it's interesting for me to see that when I first took step in the garage, albeit as a IT engineer. And quite often I used to go into the garage and watch the mechanics doing the car strips and rebuilds. And there was one day when I was watching a guy rebuild the gearbox, put the gearbox cover plate back on, and he was using wire to lock the bolts, which is a standard practice in aircraft. Yeah. Using thin wire to lock the heads together, stop them coming out. And he'd done what we call anti-locked it. So he'd anti-locked it in the wrong sense. It wasn't being pulled tight. it's been pulled apart. An engineer would know. Anyway, I told the guy, and he said, how do you know? You're an IT man. I said, well, I used to work on aircraft for 18 years. He said, well, what you doing IT for? You should be in here.
It's funny.
And he wasn't very impressed that I spotted that, though.
That's interesting what you said about the Formula One world being like the military world, and because it kind of makes sense because the seriousness of of Formula One, it's so high pressure, it's so high stakes. You know how easily you don't win enough and you die basically, and not literally, but your team dies, and so it makes sense, and you have to be the best of the best of the best. So it just makes sense to me why it's nothing like civilian life and is highly regimented, like the Air Force.
I was surprised in Formula One how much it takes out of you. You really have to commit your life to it, really, and it is just a way of life. You can't take any holidays, and once the season finishes, that's when you can take your annual leave. But you have to complete that before the car rebuild starts at the beginning of Jan. So you basically got November and December to take holiday, which is very controlling. And then with the amount of races they're having now, you end up being away from home for a long time. Sometimes when they got these races, 3 races back to back, it's really grinds you down. It's a lot of work.
Right. Well, yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted. In some ways, being like being in the military is the same in a way, Yeah. But it's not for the faint-hearted. But very good. Okay. Next question were you impressed about the tech in racing world when you joined the F1 team, and was there a race you will remember forever for some reason?
Yeah, I mean, tech-wise, I was surprised at just the electrical looms in the car. They're exactly the same as aircraft looms, made to the same standards, using the same materials. And all the engineering practices on the car is exactly what you would see on an aircraft. So it's almost like you're looking at an airframe that doesn't fly when you look at a Formula One car. And so I was impressed at the engineering standards that they carried. And sorry, what's the second part, Cap?
So was there a particular race that you'll remember for some reason, or a particular event that you remember for some reason?
Indianapolis 2005. I think it's only the second time we'd been there. There was a problem with the Michelin tyres. They were degrading too much through one of the chicanes, and they actually caused a bad crash for one of our drivers, Ralph Schumacher. On the Friday, he went into a wall and destroyed the car. I've still got the photos of it. And they decided on race day that all the Michelin shod cars would go out on the formation lap and just pull into the garages, because they weren't willing to race. So only the Bridgestone cars raced, and that was 6 cars, and it caused a big fuss. We in the garage didn't really know what was happening until it was announced to us halfway through the formation lap that the cars were coming back in. We'd heard rumours, but we didn't know, and it was really bizarre. That's it, we didn't run the race, but we had to go out and do the formation lap, because if you don't start the race, and that's counted as starting the race, you lose out on media money or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the one that stands out for me.
Right.
Very bizarre weekend.
So it was back in the day when you'd have more than one tyre manufacturer in the sport, competing tyre manufacturer. One thing I picked up on there was you saying how they're using those kind of aviation practices, and I guess because, again, it's so important that a nut doesn't come undone. It's so important that, that loom doesn't get where it's not as important as, say, a normal car just going up and down the road. So you have to have those. You have to have those standards of engineering.
That's right. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay. Right. Well, let's push on then. Was the Tornado the only jet at the time equipped with radar, and was it a good platform for various mission types?
Well, the Buccaneer had a radar before the Tornado. The Buccaneer's radar was called a Blue Parrot, and it was primarily a maritime radar for when it was carrying the Sea Eagle missile for the ship attacks. So it'd be coming in at extremely low level, sea skimming, and the radar was able to pick out the ships at very long range. And I believe I think the radar actually passed the information to the missile before it launched, and the missile knew where it was going. I wasn't a weapons man, so that might be wrong. But anyway, it was Sea Eagle missiles that the Buck was carrying for the anti-shipping maritime defense missions. And the Blue Parrot was a very capable radar, and it also did land mapping. I don't think it could do ground moving targets, but they definitely used it for identifying land masses during navigation. So yeah, the Blue Parrot preceded the Tornado radar. I didn't work on the Tornado operationally, as I said, so I can't really account for its performance radar-wise, although I'm aware of the Blue Circle scenario that we had when they had to use the concrete ballast. So yeah, that statement is a little bit wrong, because the Buck did have a very efficient radar.
Roger. Yeah, and I was actually unaware. I was just looking at pictures of it. I mean, it's small, obviously, compared to a modern air-to-air radar, but it's...
Oh, yeah, that's it.
It's quite cool.
That's the one.
Yeah, wow.
Oh, yeah, it's quite simplistic compared to today's modern offerings, but no, it did the job.
We've got a cool kind of 60s scope there to look at, and you can have a dot wherever you see a ship and lock onto it with your Sea Eagle, and that's pretty smart.
Yeah, none of your multicoloured displays played.
Very good.
The good old CRT.
Okay, very good. What was the Royal Air Force like in the 70s? I mean, you're slightly, just missed that. But was it much different? Was it a much different institution than it is now? And was the Cold War a real feel for you and your colleagues?
I think it was a lot different. So I joined in '78. Obviously, the Cold War was in everyone's minds, because that was the prime threat from the East. And it wasn't until I got out to Germany, to Larbrück, then I really felt like I was almost in a war zone, because when you're on the UK bases, there wasn't really much hardening of buildings or anything. But as soon as you got out to Germany, there's so many hardened structures, and you're operating... Your procedures are like war procedures. And every few weeks I had to spend time in it wasn't the QRA, it was like quick launch area. I can't remember the name of it. It was 4 hardened houses in a highly secured area on the other side of the airfield, northern side of Larbrück airfield. And you had to go and live in there for a week. Service the aircraft. It was in there with nukes fitted already.
Wow.
And when you went and worked on the aircraft, you always had a policeman with you with his gun pointed at you.
Huh.
Nukes were live. And I could talk about this now, before I couldn't. And there was different zones painted on the floor of the HAS where you couldn't go. You weren't allowed to touch the weapon. I had to go in the cockpit and do checks and put power on and do checks. But funny enough, the policeman didn't come up the ladder and what I was doing. He was still standing in his area.
What was he there for?
I think if you were to try and sabotage the weapon, I guess his orders were to stop you by the rule of minimum force. Nobody ever actually tested it, funnily enough.
The threat was enough, wasn't it? Yeah,
it did make one a little bit nervous, I must say.
Right. Nothing like a bit of pressure. And sorry, what planes were those that we were trading with?
That was on the Buccaneer.
So there's Buccaneer in Germany with live nukes?
At RF Larbrück. With live nukes ready to launch. We were pretty much on the end of the runway. The secure area was just off the northern taxiway. And when we did practices, sometimes they would let the siren go and you didn't know if it was real or not. And you'd run out to the house, the air crew would sleep and be in their kit all day, and they would run out, get in the cockpit, you'd fire up, and you would drill this every day, and they would be able to start up within a few minutes and taxi out onto the runway and like launch within 3 minutes.
Wow.
It would be a rapid launch. So that was it, and you wouldn't know if it was real or not until they'd actually taken off, and then you'd be told it is no duff or exercise.
And what years was this roughly?
That would have been 81.
81.
80,
right,
81.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we just had 2 aircraft on standby. We would only normally launch one during an exercise. So that's quite demanding.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a different world, doesn't it? You've got, I mean, that must have been pretty much the norm back then. You've got a bunch of airfields along the border, and you've got them sitting there with live nuclear bombs, and guys pointing guns at you while you arm them up. Can you imagine that being done now?
Yeah, I know. It's really,
great.
And that really brought it home to you that you were there for a reason, and that's it. It just made you realise what you signed up for. And but as I said, luckily I wasn't in the Falklands being shot at, so that was it was interesting times in the height of the Cold War.
Yeah, really are. Yeah, just things like that, and just thoughts of the Vulcan. A few years before, booming around with the blue Danube or whatever on, big live nuclear bombs, just massive things.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Right. Is the aircraft propulsion system combined with the word engine, or is it a more complicated cluster of systems?
It's kind of, there's 2 different states. There's engine or engine change unit, ECU. So an engine is basically just the engine with no ancillary components attached to it. It's just a singular engine. And when it becomes an ECU, it has relevant airframe components attached to it that are required for it to be mounted into an airframe. And then also there's an extension of the engine in the airframe which doubles up to fuel systems, throttle systems, sometimes fuel control units, which are not mounted on the engine. That's especially in the helicopters. They had control boxes in the aircraft itself. So they call it a dressed engine sometimes, but engine change unit means it has been prepared to go into the airframe. And sometimes they don't have a jet pipe or reheat unit attached to the engine because that's classed as semi-airframe side. So that's the differentiating points of those 2 scenarios.
Interesting. Okay, very good. Is jumping from one aircraft type to another a major shock towards doing your duties, or are all the jets similar?
I wouldn't say it's a major shock. So for instance, when I got to Honington, started working on the Buccaneer, and then after I was familiar with that, I was asked to cross-train over to the Hunter, which is aircraft-wise quite a different machine. It wasn't what I'd call a big shock. It's just another set of systems you need to learn. And for flight line operations, it's pretty much the same. As long as all you have to learn is where the fuel goes in and where to check the oil and how to replenish the aircraft, what to inspect. You get to know the aircraft and all their foibles and all the sharp bits that you mustn't bang your head on. I guess a lot of it is safety side of it. So no, it's not a big deal going from one to the other. No.
Roger. Into Fantasyland now. What's your favourite aircraft of all time and why, with no restrictions?
I would probably say the Buccaneer because I'm biased. However, the F-16 has quite a nice place in my memories. When we used to see it out on the flight line, the red flag, we had a name for it. We called it a naughty because it just looks naughty.
Yeah.
And that was the name that all us guys on 16 Squadron gave it. We called it a naughty. And I don't know, I always used to go up to them and have a look around, and they're like, just the skin is totally different to our old aircraft, our 1950s agricultural flying machines. And all the panels fit really nice, and all the screws are high spec, and they're just really well put together. And they are a fighting machine. They really are. They're just really nice aircraft. Everything about them, when you just look at them close up, is amazing. And their flight characteristics and what they can do in the multi-role arena is fantastic. They are, to me, the Fighting Falcon Viper is just amazing. So yeah, I think I'd have to say that alongside the Buccaneer, those two. The Buccaneer is basically because it's a 1950s British jet that has really been through the mill, and it is, as I said, agricultural engineering. Some of it is vastly over-engineered. But I think mainly because they were planning it for all those deck traps in the Navy, and it was just sadly let down by that wing spar problem. So, but it had a sort of head-up display. It's more like an attack site. So it didn't actually have a HUD as we know it today, but it had a fair bit in there. And yeah, the radars I'd mentioned. Well, as any aviation enthusiast will know, it really proved its worth at the red flag exercises.
Exactly. Yeah.
When we rocked up with this ancient old tractor and kicked the arse out of F-15s and what have you. Yeah, so it really did the job. So yeah, those two aircraft.
Very good. Next, do you need a different approach when working on the propulsion systems of combat jets versus choppers versus prop aircraft? Or is it the same philosophy, just different parts?
I think same philosophy really. It's all engineering. I suppose there's the safety aspect of it, whereas the turbojet, you've got a lot of thrust coming out the back. Helicopter, you've got lots of spinny things, and obviously propeller aircraft, you've got highly dangerous propellers spinning around. So there's that from the sort of flight line aspect of it. But when it comes down to maybe in deep strip or overhaul, it's pretty much the same. Once you've picked up one fuel pump, you've seen them all really. And no, it's it's, I would probably say the safety aspect of it during flight line operation. Flight line operations is probably the most important aspect.
The next question talks about the latest big engine changes from whatever it was, 2.4 V10s or whatever it was, and then they went to this hybrid technology. Was that before 2015? I've forgotten because you were up until.
I was there when that happened.
Right. I'm going to read the question then. Was there a big shock through the F1 teams when the rules came in and the engine CC and power was reduced? I'm pretty sure it must be talking about the hybrid era was introduced.
Yeah.
And did this make the races any less dangerous? And what was the idea behind it?
So the idea behind it was saving money, I guess. I think it ended up with teams having to spend more money in development,
definitely.
Especially in the battery technology and how that energy is harnessed from the engine to go back into the battery and vice versa, getting out of the battery into the engine drivetrain. It was a big technological exercise. It wasn't a shock because the FIA, when they rewrote that rule book, let us know well before. Obviously, the engine manufacturers had to get their act together and start doing a whole load of new development. It really did turn everything on the tables, though, and those battery packs are really dangerous because of the DC voltage that they contain. That's why you see the drivers jumping out of the car after they've had an incident. They stop out on track. They're instructed to jump off the seat onto the ground, because if you ground yourself and the car's live, it can kill you quite easily.
Right. How interesting.
And there's the car can become live if you've got a fault in the electrical system. The battery packs are just really, really dangerous. I've seen a movie of one going up in the smoke, and it's not very funny. So I dare say I've been out of F1 5 years now, and they're fully on top of it. But when it was all new technology, some of it was all a bit of a mystery to us, especially with the new terminology like the MGUK and kinetic reclaim systems. Yeah, it's all very new stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for me, from the spectator's point of view, I hated the change for all sorts of reasons. But for the reason for me, it really messed the competition up a lot. In that, it led to what's now become the monopoly of Mercedes, which is kind of what I'm boycotting against at the moment, because I'm just so sick of the same guys winning it. What 7 years in a row now? It's not an interesting motorsport for me to watch anymore because of that, and the fact that no one can keep up. And as well as that, teams like your old team, from being winners of multiple championships before to being right near the back, it's not right. And I'd rather, I know it will never go back to good old fashioned, big engine, big car, just race the bloody thing. Now it's all computers and saving the planet and helping polar bears and stuff. But for me, it kind of killed it off a lot, and I hope we have something to come and address that.
Indeed, I think when Williams was an engineering company building racing cars, that is what they excelled in. But now that the technology has moved on vastly in huge steps and at such a pace, it's very difficult to keep up for the smaller teams because the technology is just so advanced now. It's huge. And I agree with you. It's I think it's detracting from the sport rather than adding to it.
I mean, it's more about who's got the best laptop, by which I mean car now, rather than back in the 90s when Senna and it was just so much more interesting, I found. But anyway, we could talk forever about that. But we'll Cameron, who was was your favourite F1 driver of all time, and why?
I would say James Hunt from the older years, because he was like a really good
rock star
racer, and he was a rock star. You'd see him walking up and down the pit lane, smoking a fag, dolly bird on the arm, drinking a beer. And he was a good competitor as well. He was a good driver, good racer. Shame that he left us earlier than he should have. But and even when he was doing the commentary after he'd finished with Formula One and he was commentating alongside Murray Walker, they were just such a fantastic pair in the commentary booth. No, I wish I'd been around when James was driving. So he'd definitely be my choice. And from more modern days, I would probably say Montoya, because he came to Williams when I first started.
I remember, from Indy, right?
Yes, that's right. And he gave Michael Schumacher a really good run for his money. And nobody else seemed to be doing that at the time. And I really sort of took my hat off to him for having the guts to really stand up to him on the racetrack and give him a run for his money. And he did. He absolutely did. And and he was a nice guy because I used to work with him quite closely. He liked gaming, so I ended up fixing his laptop a lot.
That's good.
And he's a good guy. And he towards my last years at Williams, he used to come and visit us in the garage at various races, and he'd always come and say hello. Not a prima donna.
No, I know. I'm sure there's a lot of that. But for mine, just out of interest, for me, I was in the Senna years. In his last kind of, 5 years was my golden years of watching Formula One, and how he was just always on it, always flat out, always. You know?
Yeah.
And nowadays, my equivalent of him would be probably Max Verstappen. Stappen, I can never say it. But
Yeah,
in the way
fantastic.
that he's always the underdog. He's never got the fast car, expensive car, and
Yeah.
yet he always achieves above what you'd expect him to achieve. And
He
again,
does.
he's pure. And if you know, it's about tactics, Formula One nowadays, and it's all about pit stops and stuff. But for him, he's the old James Hunt. All he wants to do is win, go as fast as he possibly can. You know, piss off to what the rest of you think or try and tell me to do, and I'm always going to race. And I think that's, again, from the spectators, I mean, for a Formula One boss, that's not very good because you can't control him. But for me, as a spectator, you know he's going to entertain you. You know he's going to do that mad charge here, even if he ends up crashing, which he does a lot. But that's what you want to see, and that's, yes, it is a bit dangerous, but Formula One, I think, should be a bit dangerous. If it's not, then I'm not going to watch it.
Absolutely.
I don't want to watch people being safe.
I think the same goes for most spectators. Definitely, I like Max. He's very good, and you very rarely see him lose his rag. Even if he has an incident that's not his fault, he doesn't get out the car and start shouting and punching. He's just accepts it. He's really good. Good driver, cool head.
Yeah, hopefully a future champion when it gets sorted out. But anyway, very good. Did you notice any similarities between the F1 racing cars and the combat jets? We've talked about that, but anything you want to add before we move on?
I think I've probably said it all, really. Yeah, like, no, it's just like an airframe that doesn't fly. You've got a pilot, you've got engineering, you've got computers. You just don't drop any bombs. You just go quickly.
And it's interesting in Formula One how much it is, because you've got essentially restricted horsepower. It's so much about aerodynamics, which of course is, aircraft is all aerodynamics. There's so much about aerodynamics and aerodynamic modelling, aerodynamic testing in Formula One. I mean, that lot must be X aviation. That must be where those people and that skill set have come from. X aviation aerodynamicists.
The aero side of it is so huge now, and the amount of resources and money that goes into the development of the aero side. Not only the wind tunnels, there's the CFD, the computational fluid dynamics, which takes a vast amount of computing power to do properly. Right. But even then, with all of that, 2 wind tunnels and all those computers, you can have a perfect solution in the wind tunnel, and you get it on the track, and a side wind will just show that something's really wrong. And it's just really weird how I've seen it before in real life, and it's just so frustrating. And it is for the designers and chief engineers, obviously. But it just goes to prove you can have all that technology, improve it off the track, and as soon as you get on the track, there'll be something that you haven't seen.
So that shows why actual testing season is so important on a racetrack in real life, not in bits and bytes.
Indeed.
Yeah, and another thing that I forgot what I was going to say, which is annoying, but okay. That's the other thing I was going to say. How a lot of people say why, for instance, DCS isn't modelled better. It's modelled pretty good. It's not perfect. It's it's good enough. Why don't they model it better? Why don't they model it better? Well, you can keep modeling better and better and better. The problem is you start to waste so much computer resource, but gaining very little. You can never model anything perfectly. You've got to have that fine balance of where the game will run, and this is the same with all sims over the years for their respective computers. You've got to have that balance of where they will run. The computer will run, and you'll get your 30, 50 frames a second, and it's modelled as best it can, and you've got to get that mix. And therefore you've only got so much resources you can go into it. And you say, like, you've got Williams with a factory of 1,000 computers sitting working on this one tiny little 1 second fluid simulation, and even that's not perfectly accurate. That's
I think anyone who dismisses DCS is foolish, because I mean, when you're sat in the cockpit and you look around, if you've got a track IR, it looks so realistic, and you can see the effort that goes into some of the very small effects. I heard someone say the other day, once an engine shut down, you can hear the blades rattling as the compressor's spooling down, and that is so. Because I remember on the Spade, their blades have a lot of play in them in the compressor, and even if the wind blows through the engine when the blanks aren't on, you can hear it go tick 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 tick, and that's so realistic. So for them to put such detail in like that for just a consumer flight simulation. It's incredible. It is.
So for the Phantom, did the Yanks use the J79 and we used the Spey? Is that how it worked? I've forgotten.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Reheated Spey.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Right. Where are we? Have you ever been deployed around the globe? And if so, is it more different when you are at the front line and still have to return to those jets in the air? What's he saying?
I'm not quite sure. I kind of touched on this before, saying I didn't get deployed to the Falklands because I was already on a war roll at Loughborough doing the Cold War stuff, and then we did used to go for bombing practice in Sardinia, the base called Deci Momanu, which any RAF person would know well. We used to go there and do a lot of practice. They got a really good range there and fantastic weather. You just fly all day in clear weather and do loads of bombing. We also used to go up to Lossiemouth, where we could use the ranges at Octane and do the live paveway droppings. I used to go. So I haven't actually had a war deployment. The nearest thing I got was sat in the QRA at Loughborough waiting for the big button to be pushed. And I don't really know what it's asking. We used to go at Hollington. We used to do OTRs, operational turnarounds, when we had a dispersal actually next to the runway near the piano keys, and the jets used to land, backtrack up the runway, park on this dispersal, which was just off the runway, and we'd have all the equipment there to turn them around, and we'd have to do a super fast operational turnaround, which was a cut down version of the normal day-to-day turnaround, where you just check the essentials. And sometimes the pilots would just stay in the jet, or they would just jump out for a quick leak and a stretch of the legs and jump back in, and you get the jet started as soon as you could after it had been refueled, and get it back in the air again. All the plumbers, we called the weapons guys plumbers. The plumbers would be down there with all their weapons to refit. Might just be smoke and flash practice bombs, but that was it. We do a rearm, refuel, check the essentials, and send it off again. So that was quite interesting, doing really fast turnarounds. I don't know if I've answered this question.
No, well, we've done our best. The next one's interesting. But interesting to get your opinion on this. Something I've not really thought about. So, for instance, you get a very modern fighter plane like an F-35, like the latest Russian one, the Su-57. You take their engine, and the question is how can you make so much power now from one of those engines, 40,000+ pounds of static thrust, whereas the same size and weight engine, more or less, Spey, for instance, back in the 70s could only make, 19,000 pounds of thrust, and the same, and in between in the 90s, F-16 engine could make just kind of approaching 30,000 pounds. What is it that means that you can have the same roughly size of chunk of metal, but can get over twice the power out of the thing now? Any opinions on that?
Yeah, good question. It is all down to the materials being used and the engineering, manufacturing processes that are in use. And Rolls-Royce are creating blades out of ceramic and all sorts of exotic materials now. And also they're able to cool the hot components in the turbine area a lot more efficiently. If you can keep a hot area cool in the right areas, it becomes more efficient, because it just does. And I understand the question. It's just down to the engineering and the components and the materials being used. Just the modern engineering is so advanced, and because everything's computer designed to the optimal airflow and cooling and what have you, it's It's just like a work of art, the engineering now, rather than someone putting it together in their backyard. It's just advanced so much since Frank Whittle's first experiments, and it is very impressive the amount of energy that they can create from these machines. You could say a similar thing about a Formula One engine.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. Yeah.
How on earth did they get that power out of what is essentially just an engine similar to what you'd get in a decent road car? And it isn't. The fuel is the same.
Yep.
The fuel is the same octane. It's probably purer. I think they filter the fuel a bit more. But yeah, it's just down to advancements of materials and engineering knowledge.
Yeah, and this is, it means the whole world is up, is leveled up, you know. So everyone has access off or on to this newer understanding of ways of designing things, ways of simulating things, ways of making things. You just didn't have the machine. You know, you can imagine in the 1960s or 70s making parts for a spade with a CNC machine that could get these crazy angles that there's no way you could make a jig for that out of a piece of steel. You just couldn't do it.
No.
So to things you can do that you simply couldn't do, and like you said, the money's gone in, the research has gone into metallurgy and other types of materials, and which takes time. It takes years or tens of years to develop these materials and prove them and certify them. And you can get an extra few horsepower, like an extra few degrees Celsius. You can, you know, and it adds up over 50 years to where you're making twice the horsepower. You know what I mean, twice the thrust.
There's a funny story that I heard from Rolls-Royce that Pratt & Whitney sent Rolls-Royce a drill bit that was so tiny they thought it was the tiniest drill bit in the world ever manufactured. Rolls-Royce took a look at it and sent it back to Pratt & Whitney with a hole drilled through the centre of it.
That's so funny.
I don't know if it's true, but that's what I heard.
Right, there's a lot of expertise in those companies, literally more than anywhere else in the world, you know, passed down by, you know, generations of workers, and there's a lot. Okay, anyway, we should push on. Sorry for a noob question, but who first thought about fitting an afterburner to an engine, and where did the idea come from? Are there any afterburner systems in operation? Are there different afterburner systems in operation, or is it the same principle? God, never thought of that. What's the fast afterburner? I'm just thinking.
They're all pretty much the same. There's different methods of igniting them at the back end, but they've been researching it since before the Second World War. I certainly know when the X-15 was around doing the sound barrier stuff, they were doing, is it NACA, part of the NASA bunch in America? NACA guys were doing a lot of afterburner research. I think the first British aircraft was Lightning and Concorde to have reheat. Is that right?
Well, it's a 50s plane. The Lightning.
That sounds about right. Yeah, so it's been around for a long time, and I guess in the modern jets, the technology's come a hell of a long way, especially with the nozzle technology that you get nowadays. Really exotic nozzle with all the petals that can move in many directions, multi-directional nozzles. It's no, good question. So I don't really know when it started, but it's been around for a long time. Not necessarily implemented in operational aircraft, but they've definitely been playing with it, if you like, for many years.
So my understanding of the general format that's been accepted is you're going to have rings to get a kind of uniform fuel injection. You can have rings inside the jet pipe that we're going to allow, and those rings are presumably going to have exits all over them to allow the fuel to come out and atomize. Regards the ignition, you're going to need, even when you're in a hot jet stream, you're going to need ignition. So you have what my mind works like, not too different from a constantly firing spark plug. What are they actually like?
I think they called it a hot streak igniter, where it was almost like a pilot light on a gas burner.
Yep.
So it was constantly lit, and sometimes those sort of shower heads, or whatever you want to call them, those rails, used to sit in gutters, so they were protected from the air coming out of the engine, the jet efflux. And yeah, they used to have this hot streak igniter constantly running, where the fuel was just going to come out, but it is just plain fuel that comes out into the jet stream just at the back of the turbine.
Yeah, I'd love to get my head in there and have a good scrummage around. Not that easy.
It's good. They always smell the same. They always smell really burnt metal, and the smell is always the same.
Okay, they must have some hardcore metals there, because they're in, I don't know, probably over 1,000 degrees C, maybe.
Yeah,
maybe not quite that much.
Titanium.
Yeah,
lots of titanium, I reckon.
Okay. All right, we should push on. What is the most difficult part of the engine to inspect and to repair, and why? Is there a case where an engine gets written off and recycled because the costs, written off because it's too expensive to repair? Interesting, that one.
Right. The hardest area to inspect would be the combustion chamber, basically because it's tucked away in the centre of the engine, and you can't get to it. You can't see it because at the back there's the turbine, hot turbine, and then you've got the compressor at the front. So every engine will have inspection holes built into it, where you get an endoprobe or endoscope, which is like a long metal rod with a lens on the end attached to a camera system. You can either put your Mark 1 eyeball on the end and look through a little telescope thing and inspect that way, or probably more is the case nowadays, it feeds into a video recorder with a screen, and you just stick the probe in, it goes right into the combustion chamber. You can look at all of the burner systems and make sure they haven't got charcoal all over them, and look for cracks on the internal casing. So that's the hardest place to inspect, the combustion chamber. As far as writing an engine off, no, you wouldn't. Normally, the sort of damage you get is compressor damage from FOD, foreign object debris, or damage. So that's, nuts and small animals going down the intake. Cause a lot of problems. But to repair that, you'd normally get away with getting it into the overhaul facility, getting the compressor module out, replacing the blades as required. It needs rebalancing after that. The rotating assembly would need rebalancing, but the compressor blades normally sit on their own shaft that's part of the big long shaft that runs through the engine. So you just replace as required and put it back in service. If it's had a catastrophic failure, as in blades releasing in operation and puncturing the casing, I guess you'd write off the module and fit a new rotating assembly and casing. But you would never really write off a whole engine because of the modular sense that they've got. You would just replace that module that's damaged.
Two questions. First, did you ever deal with any overheat damage where combustion-wise things got too hot?
No.
And what about, you've got a series of shafts down the centre. Those are going to be on bearings of some sort. When you get an imbalance of a crankshaft in a car, you can kill those bearings. Could you kill the bearings or have you seen damaged bearings in an aeroplane?
It's quite rare because we use roller bearings and ball bearings in the engine, depending on which area it's in and whether it's going to translate thrust into the engine or whether it's just dealing with a radial load. And also the oil that's lubricating the bearings excuse me, is monitored with magnetic plugs that are checked on a regular basis, and the oil's analyzed. At certain service periods, the oil itself is taken out and sent for spectromatic oil analysis, and that's where it's burnt under a flame, and they see how much metal is in the oil.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of measures in place to make sure
I
that
see. That's
those bearings are looked after.
It's really interesting. So you've got that system. Helicopters the same. You've got chip detectors. I mean, slightly different, but chip detectors can do it on the fly. Presumably just electromagnets again. I always wonder why you don't have chip detectors in a car. I mean, it can save you so many thousands of pounds on a new engine just to say, oh right, I can see there's chips occurring. Let's go and get it stripped down. But cost versus
Absolutely, yeah, it would make sense for sure, because it gives you, that's the earliest path you've got for preempting a catastrophic failure. It would give you a good advance warning that something is failing and you need to have a look.
Because in a car, if you get any kind of advance warning on almost any failure, it's a relatively easy job. However you look at it, replacing the shells on the crank, whatever, it's actually quite an easy job. You don't have to strip the whole engine down and so on. But if you let it go, and it does go, then
expensive.
It's a whole new engine. But okay, anyway, off track again. This one, I don't actually agree with this question, but see what you think. Why the old systems of the first jets with separate combustion chambers, like MiG-15, 262, the Avon, was not developed any further, but instead developed into turbojets? What were the benefits and setbacks? Now, I must be misunderstanding. Now, obviously, yes, I understand those old engines had separate external combustion chambers, but he seems to be suggesting that as it went into the 60s and onwards, that there weren't separate combustion chambers, but there were. Even if you take probably a Spey or a Tornado engine, they probably will have separate combustion chambers. It's just you don't see them on the outside like those big cylinders because they're designed and they're kept in casings. My understanding is actually very rare to have it happens, but it's very rare to have a common combustion chamber where there's just one big combustion kind of cylinder. But your thoughts on that? That was my understanding of engines.
You're pretty much right. Definitely, the first engines just had those cans all around with interconnecting pipes, and to balance out the pressure, they used to have air pipes connecting them. And then they put a shroud around them so that they were enclosed. Then they started moving towards what they call the can annular system, or just the annular combustion chamber, which is just a double-skinned round combustion chamber with just a big area. Now, I think it was because of it's easier to engineer and it's cleaner for burning and less maintenance as well. And it's just a single component. The combustion chamber, an annular combustion chamber, is just one component. It takes a lot of manufacturing itself, but it's just one thing that can be quite easily changed on overhaul as opposed to a load of cans. So I actually think most modern jet engines are using the annular system. Right. I will have a look into it actually, because I don't know for sure. I don't think there's many new engines using cans anymore. So the move, I think it's just like a natural engineering progression.
Yep.
And it was due to ease of maintenance, ease of manufacture. And yeah, I'd have to Google it a bit more for an in-depth explanation, but
okay, very good. Okay, it would be interesting to see when the change happened, or it's probably over several decades, I imagine. But okay, where are we now? What engine configuration is an F1 car racing nowadays? Are the engines for F1 teams built only to last one race, and can you use the parts of the old unit to build the new one? How long does it take your team to replace an engine and get the car back on track? Several questions there, kind of general knowledge for F1.
Right. Okay. So, well, the engines nowadays have to last 7 races, is it? I think it's 7 races they have to last. And they're not allowed to be worked on in between races because they're sealed away by the FIA in between races. I think you have to apply to the FIA to do certain maintenance tasks on race engines. You can't interchange parts. They have to be a single unit from race 1 to race 7. Then they go back to the engine manufacturer's overhaul facility and get stripped down, inspected, and rebuilt for next season or whatever they do with them. But definitely you can't chop and change parts. Sometimes if there's a component they can replace, they have to apply to the FIA and maybe take a penalty, or they're allowed it. I think it all depends whether it affects performance or not. Not working on the engine side, I can't say for sure, but that's pretty much it. But yeah, they have to last 7 races nowadays due to the new regulations.
Yep.
Whereas before it was 1 or 2 races, and that's all the engines were really set up for.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, go ahead.
What's the next one?
Well, the next one was, how long does it take to replace? And that goes back to the idea of the engine being modular again. It's designed to come out of that car relatively easily.
Right. So, say for instance in practice 3, which is on, no, I'm getting it wrong. In between, right, let's say practice 1 on Saturday morning, you get an engine failure mid-session. You can get an engine change ready to get it out in practice 2. So, but it's quite a quick turnaround. It can be done, and the crews have to be pretty much flat out. And I've seen it right down to the wire, whereas the last engine run has been done just as the pit lane lights go green. So it's a really tight schedule, and nothing can go wrong. There's a lot to do in an engine change. They always have an engine ready. There's always one ready, dressed. Dressed means it's got everything on it to offer it up to the car and fit it. Pretty much like I was saying, like the aircraft side of it. You get the engines from whoever your supplier is as just an engine, but you can't put it on the car like that. You have to put extra car-y bits on the outside of it so it can fit. So yeah, there's always an engine ready, and they can change an engine really quick, but it's not an easy procedure. There's a load of checks to do afterwards, loads. And yeah, you can do it in between practice sessions, but it's a tight call. And sometimes on the telly, you'll see them scurrying around in the first few minutes of practice 2 after they've just finished an engine change, and it's a tight one.
Roger. Okay, next one. This is right up my alley, actually. What mixture is a racing engine running on, and why? And will it run on normal fuel? I'll do the mixture if you don't mind. And so the Formula One is a turbo engine, although it's a little bit smaller and much more powerful, but essentially the same as the engine in my Nissan. And they're going to run on the same idea of the same fuel to air ratio. However much you change an engine, actually changing the fuel to air ratio doesn't change very much because of the way petrol burns. It has to burn at a certain ratio. Yep. Too rich, she won't burn. She'll burn very badly, and it'll burn too cold, basically. Too hot, and it'll explode. Like high explosive, rather than a nice progressive kind of cordite-like thing like we saw with that Canberra. So you've got to get it right. And so for my car, I do my engine tuning. It's just something I've always been interested in. I've got
well done.
Yeah,
well
I got mine set at 11.6 is my ratio. So that's 11.6 weight of air to fuel. That's right, getting right on the limits. What we consider a little bit lean for a turbo car, about 11 with belts are sensible. But I wanted to get as much horsepower as I could, avoiding any hot burn. They push it further in the. I just checked on Google. It's about 12.5. So they're pushing it much more than you would do on a road car. However, we have to consider the fact on our road cars that we don't have perfectly engineered fuel, or maybe a word regulated fuel. You know, we get it from this petrol station, we get it from that petrol station. They're all slightly different, so we have to give a little bit of leeway. So I've given, if I went to 12.5 on mine, I would bang another 50 horsepower out of it. But the chances of it burning hot, burning too lean, and therefore detonating just too high. So 12.5. On a modern turbo Formula One engine, and it says, will it run out of? Will it run on normal fuel? Any idea what kind of petrol they use? I mean, guessing it is petrol, right?
Yeah, I'll answer that one first. The fuel is exactly the same as domestic road car fuel.
Right.
it's delivered in barrels to us at the track, normally on the Tuesday. For European races, it'd be on Tuesday or Wednesday. The guy from Elf or wherever he comes from brings the fuel to us. It's all sealed. There'll be an FIA guy there with a sample kit. We're there with our sample kit, and the driver of the truck who brought it here has a sample kit. You all open it up together and take samples. That goes off for analysis. It is normal, what we would call 4-star. I believe it is highly filtered. It's super clean. There's no impurities. It is analysed by the FIA. They take samples from every team, and I don't know if they do it at the track or if they send it off, but it is analysed for octane value. And then that's it. We decant it into the little fuel bowsers that they use in the garage, ready to go in the car. And then as far as ratio goes, right, I don't know, because so when I left Williams, we were with Mercedes, and you pretty much in the garage you have the Williams people and the Mercedes people. And when we all sit at the telemetry desks, you'll have the Williams guys, which is like what you might call the airframe, the chassis people, and then the engine people at one end. Now, the code sets the ratio. We, as the team, don't see the code. It's secret.
Oh, that's annoying.
It's highly secret. And there's a lot of measures put in place by Mercedes to protect it. And also the software tools and everything that programs all the boxes that control the car. That's it. It's just like, it's their business. And you don't get any look in at all. That's it. The engine guys are super, super secretive. We did know that the other teams running Mercedes engines use different code to us. And I think depending on how much you paid for your engine contract, depended on what code you got to run out on the track. So yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint, Cap, but I really, really don't know. Just down to the secrecy the engine guys put over that code that sets all those parameters within the engine.
Okay. And just before we move on, because I never ever get a chance to talk about cars to anyone, especially with lockdown. The only other little thing that's really interesting if you're into cars as well, Mark briefly talked about the octane of the fuel. The higher the octane, it doesn't make it any more powerful, but it means you can run the engine hotter with less chance of detonation. You can call it octane. I think in America generally it's octane. In my world it's RON, resistance of knock. It means just essentially the same thing.
That's right. Yeah.
And the interesting thing about, let's call it resistance of knock, is that it's dynamic in a fuel. So if I get some fuel and I have it delivered, the guys that Mark said, they'll check the RON, or they'll check the octane, come up with a figure. But if they go and leave the barrel over a set of days and weeks, the octane or the RON will actually reduce just because of how this chemical reaction works in fuel, which is why engine tuning and using fuels is so. It might even be the same thing with aeroplane. I don't know. That's a bit beyond me. But so if I have to have a certain octane of fuel in my car, the same as Mark's Williams car had to. So I can't leave the fuel for more than about 2 weeks in my car because the octane or the RON has got to a certain level where I can no longer use it for the risk of detonation. I don't have an expensive measurer like he did, so I have to calculate. I can actually calculate the degradation of RON in fuel based on certain parameters. It's just a really interesting thing that goes through my brain. But anyway, there you go. I got to talk about cars finally. Did you enjoy your time at the training? Did you enjoy your time at the School of Technical Training? Got it out. RAF St Athan, and was it a big step forward for you at the time?
Yes, I did. It was an engineering school. I didn't particularly like my time at normal school. But I did enjoy the training, the RAF engineering training. It was really good. So the first time I went to Alton was for the flight line mechanic training, which was only 6 weeks. And you got to play around with JPs and Sea Vixens and Hunters and some Jags. And it was interesting. That was my introduction to aircraft. basically how they fly, how they work. This is an engine, and they just prepare you for the flight line operation. And then I went back 2 or 3 years later to do my fitters course, which was 9 months, and that's when I specialised in the propulsion side of it. That was really good as well. Learned about some engineering stuff I'd never learned before, and you go really in depth into the engine side, obviously. It was very interesting, really good, really good. No, it's fantastic. I just really enjoyed learning, and it's nice to get back out into the real RAF world and apply that to your new position. It's very rewarding. The RAF engineering training is second to none. It really is. And no, I'd highly recommend it to anyone.
Roger. Could you tell us about your duties as working with the F1 team as an IT specialist? Your duties about that, and if you had any time for family while on the road.
I briefly covered it before. You pretty much don't have any time to yourself when you belong to the team, especially the race team, because you're always travelling. You've always got to be on duty. My IT duties were for a European race to get there on a Tuesday. I would fly out earlier than the mechanics because I'd had to lay down all the Cat 5 cables in the garage to link everything up. Yes, we had wireless, but car stuff has to run on cables. Wireless is too flaky and too insecure. I was responsible for the pit wall, all the computers on the pit wall, and all the tellies on the pit wall. Everything in the garage, connecting the cars to the computers in the back. The cars actually have their own IP addresses. They are computers on the network, essentially. When they're plugged in the garage, they have an IP address that you can telnet to, and now the bespoke software for programming and downloading just connects to an IP and a port number. I was responsible for all the servers and stuff we have in the back room. All the screens you see the engineers looking at for telemetry. Look after the wireless system, all the comms back to base, the intercom system. We used to connect back to base using an MPLS, which is like a fancy ADSL connection, if you like, but a lot more secure and robust. I looked after all the tellies in the motorhome and the Wi-Fi in the motorhome, everybody's laptops, everybody's printing, everybody's internet access, mobile phones. When you're at European races, all the trucks that have computer desks in them for the engineers, they all need looking after. The telly feeds in the trucks and basically everything. And it's a lot. It's a lot of
I
stuff.
bet.
And there was only, for most of my time, it was only me at the track. During my last few years, I did get someone to train up who was going to take over from me. So that was a blessing. But no, when you're on your own, it's a hell of a lot. And it takes a lot of setting up. But it was good. It was good. You get to travel, albeit you see a hotel room and the inside of a garage and an airport.
Yeah, that's about it.
But there were some races where you get time in between. Australia used to be a good one because you would go, in the old days, we used to go to Malaysia after Australia and you'd have spare time. You could get 5 days off. So you could either stay in Australia or you could fly in advance to Malaysia and have 5 days off there before having to go to the track and start doing the setup again. The bit I used to hate was Sunday night, stripped down, because when you get the cars back after the race from Parc Fermé, the guys have to strip them and do whatever they do, and you've got to take the garage apart and you've got to pack everything up, and it's just, and if it's an international race, you've got to palletize everything. You can't just load it into your trucks outside. So everything has to go into boxes, ready for taking to the airport to go on the 747. And you'll be there till 2 or 3 in the morning, easy, packing all that rubbish up.
Yeah.
It's just such a drag. It whacks you out, really does. And plus, you could have the emotional drain from Sunday's race as well, whether it be good or bad. So, yeah, Sundays can be really tiring.
Roger. Yep, not for the weak, faint-hearted, like we said.
No, definitely not.
Okay, very good. I've had you for over 2 hours now, and we can't go for much
God.
longer. I know it's ridiculous. Well, I've got one more kind of question here from Hoggett, we should try and answer. Have you got access to the questions? Because these are complex.
I read Hoggett's. It was one of the last ones.
It's going to be pretty hardcore, but we're going to have a pop at him.
Okay.
Well, over the course of your career, have you seen an increase in focus on engineering British standards by engineers? If so, does it pertain to engineering in the MOD? Don't know. What time are you? What time are you? You were up to mid-90s, weren't you?
Yeah, I've been part of ISO 9001 accreditations, but I mean the RAF is following ISO adherence now, but I wasn't really involved in it that much from an engineering point of view. Only compliance and making sure things in my area were compliant. So I can't really answer that question in depth.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to the next one because it looks really interesting. I once heard from a professor who was teaching tolerancing that the MOD commonly uses the Monte Carlo method as opposed to tolerance stacks or datum conversions. I don't know what any of those are, but they're obviously ways of measuring tolerance, which is really obviously a majorly important thing in any engineering. He himself used to work for Kalashnikov and expressed regret and said engineers in the MOD do not have much say in the matter. Did you feel the same way? And are engineers given more or less freedom in Formula One? So we're talking about tolerancing, which is obviously a major thing, especially when you're working with engines. You're going to be checking, is that tolerance, is this tolerance? The questions are, does it differ between, I mean, you weren't involved in that in Formula One, but did you have similarities in Formula One and any thoughts about how it was done in MOD?
I'll answer it the best I can. He must be an engineering student or something.
Yeah, obviously.
Firstly, the Monte Carlo method is to do with randomness to solve problems, which isn't really my area. I would say the F1 engineers did have freedom, but albeit they are tied by the amount of changes that they can make to the car within the bounds of the FIA rules. So although you can change wing angles and stuff, you can't change a lot of the aerodynamics on the car. So they would have a say in design at the beginning of the season when they're making the car, or at the end, the crossover period. But we've got a design office to do all that. And really the track engineers are there to make the car runs efficiently and effectively in its state that it's brought to the track in. So their remit isn't to make major changes on the track, it is just to tune it for the driver. So there isn't really scope to have much freedom when you're at the track. You can't start doing your design at the track, otherwise you're in the wrong job. No, see, make a change on the Formula One car, it needs so much approval, design approval, then wind tunnel testing. They have to make models and test that with all the different wind tunnel specs. There's so much that happens in the background before it ever gets on the car. And then it has to be tested on the car, and we don't have weekly test sessions, so I think they do have freedom, but they're bound by the limits of what they're allowed to do by the FIA, basically.
Oh, Joe. How has the advancement of computer methods, so let's just say computer modelling, shall we, affected the engineering landscape? Is there now an increased focus on engineering design and optimization methods as opposed to when you first started your career? I mean, it's an obvious thing, but if so, how much of this is due to the differences between the military versus the private sector? And I wonder which was driving which. I wonder if the private sector, in terms of computerization, was driving the military, or the military was driving the private sector. That's a really interesting question. I don't have a clue, but
I would probably say that they were both hand in hand, neck and neck, up to the finish line, really, military and Formula One because engineering practices and everything, the development methods are so identical. Yes, it has, over the 15 years that I was doing it, massive change. Whereas before, a lot of it was just engineering, and someone had a good idea and they designed a wing this way or that way. And nowadays it really is all done on the computer, and especially the wind tunnel side of it, being able to test to great depth in the wind tunnel, whereas before they just used to have basic wind tunnels. Now they've got massive advanced ones, and all the CFD stuff, it's so computer driven now on the design side of it. It's a shame we don't see that side of it outside of the racing environment. They've started doing more TV programs on it now, but it's definitely a very interesting area. And people, youngsters who are wanting to get into engineering, should really be looking at motorsport in general to get into engineering. I would say if they want to be on the computer side of it, the CFD and all the rest of it, CAD.
Yeah, and when you started your RAF career, I imagine it was still, at least in the design side of things, it was still all slide rulers and and measuring tapes,
pencils, rulers, slide rules. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Finally, we'll round up with the key attributes needed to become a successful senior engineer. Is it more dependent on experience or exceptionalism? I don't know how you answer that, and if you have an answer to that, but any thoughts on that? People you've seen and worked with?
I think one of my favourite or most admired engineers would probably be Patrick Head, who designed some of the early Williams cars, race winners.
Yeah.
And he has a natural engineering ability and foresight to visualize stuff that nobody else has thought of before and know how it's going to work and if it's going to work. And he proved that by designing so many brilliant cars. And he also came up with some fantastic concepts also.
Was he involved in the active suspension, or was that someone else?
That was before me, but I've seen the car. That's the FW08, I think it is. Yeah, that was one of his concepts. Fantastic, and because it was so effective, they had to ban it because the car was just winning too many races. And I think a natural ability in engineering is important. I mean, you can do all the classroom work you like, but unless you've actually got the right stuff within you, I don't know. It's difficult how to define an engineer. And there's probably different sorts of engineers. Like you've got Adrian Newey, who is a fantastic aerodynamicist, but maybe not in the same vein that Patrick Head could engineer a car, and maybe vice versa. So, I mean, there's so many different spheres of engineering now. I think my overall answer to that would just be you need to have a good fundamental understanding of engineering in all aspects, and just have a natural ability to do it. If you like,
gotta have the right brain for it at the end of the day. Okay. Yeah. No, that's awesome, Mark. I've had you for nearly 2.5 hours, so it's I'm pretty exhausted, and I haven't actually done anything. So thank you very much for that. It's been really interesting talking about.
Thanks for having me.
I've learned a lot of stuff, especially about some of those old planes and the sparse failures and stuff like that. Again, sometimes this is the only way you can learn about things. It's really interesting. I know you fly with us, so I'll be seeing you in the air whenever we're on again next. Otherwise, just thank you very much, and that was cool, and I'll see you soon.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, Mark. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.